He collapsed on her porch, half dead and whispering regrets. She stitched his wound, unaware he carried the weight of a murder that ruined her life. The wind howled like a wounded thing, hurling snow across the prairie in wild, blinding gusts. Wren Calloway pulled her scarf tighter around her face, her breath fogging beneath it as she trudged through the knee-deep drifts with a battered lantern swinging in her gloved hand. She had only meant to check on the woodpile, but the wind had carried something strange, faint, muffled, not the usual cry of coyotes or snap of ice-laden branches. It had sounded like a voice, raw and broken, swallowed by the storm. She should have turned back. Any smart girl would have. But Wren was her mother's daughter, and her mother had always said that kindness wasn't supposed to be convenient. So she walked, one slow step at a time, eyes stinging and heart thudding as the cold clawed at her skin. Then she saw him. At first he looked like a bundle of coats and snow slumped against the barbed wire fence that marked the edge of their land. But the shape moved, just barely, and when she stumbled closer, her lantern caught the curve of a face beneath the ice-crusted brim of a hat. A man, slumped over, bleeding, his coat soaked dark at the ribs and his lips nearly purple. One boot was missing, the other hung loose, toes curled like he'd tried to claw his way forward before the cold took hold. She knelt beside him, dropping the lantern into the snow with a soft hiss. Her hands went to his collar, shaking him, brushing snow from his face. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 30, maybe more. A beard shadowed his jaw. His skin was pale beneath the stubble, eyes flickering open just enough to meet hers with a kind of desperate confusion. "Help!" he rasped, voice hoarse and wet. "Didn't mean to." He passed out before he could finish. Wren looked back toward the house, just a smudge of warm yellow light through the white. Then she looked at him, at the blood, the snow, the way his chest rose in shallow, struggling breaths. She didn't know who he was or what he'd done, but she knew one thing for sure. If she left him, he'd be dead before morning. It took everything she had to drag him. She looped her arms under his and pulled, step by step, her boots slipping, her breath burning. He groaned once, a low sound, but didn't wake. The snow soaked through her skirt, the wind screamed, but she didn't stop. When they finally reached the porch, her legs nearly gave out, but she shoved open the door, hauled him inside, and let him collapse by the hearth. The heat inside felt like fire on her frozen face. She kicked the door shut and lit more oil lamps, her breath still fogging. The man didn't stir. She stripped off his coat, winced at the blood soaking through his shirt. She didn't recognize the face, not right away, but there was something about the way his jaw clenched even in sleep, something too familiar. Still, she pushed the thought down. She grabbed the sewing kit, water, a clean rag, and knelt beside him. Her hands shook as she worked, cutting cloth, dabbing blood, threading the needle her mother had once used to mend torn sleeves and split fingers. The fire crackled. The wind screamed against the window panes. The man didn't wake. Wren worked in silence, her mind spinning. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why was he bleeding into her floor? But most of all, she kept hearing those words he'd whispered just before he passed out. Didn't mean to. The fire had burned low by the time he stirred, the logs now soft embers glowing under a thin veil of ash. Wren sat in the rocking chair with a bowl of broth cooling in her hands, boots off, feet aching from hauling him through the snow. She hadn't slept, not really. Just closed her eyes in short spells, her ears tuned to the faintest breath or movement. When he groaned, it was soft, like a man caught in a bad dream, but enough to make her sit up straight. His eyelids fluttered, lips dry and cracked. One arm moved feebly, knocking the edge of the quilt she'd thrown over him. She set the bowl down and moved to the side of the bed, watching him with careful eyes. He blinked, slow and heavy, then looked around the room like he didn't know where he was. His gaze stopped on her face and stayed there. "You're all right," she said, voice calm but distant. "You were half dead out there. Lucky I found you." He swallowed hard, throat working, and tried to speak. It came out as a hoarse whisper. She reached for the tin cup on the bedside table and helped him drink. He didn't resist, drank greedily, eyes never leaving hers. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing rough through his nose. "Name's Caleb," he said finally. The words rasped like gravel. "Least, that's what folks call me." She didn't give her name in return, just stood and walked to the stove, ladling warm broth into a tin bowl. Her mind ticked, every second stretching like thread pulled taut. Caleb. The name meant nothing, yet the sound of it felt heavy somehow. When she brought the bowl back, he sat up with a wince. She helped him without a word, placing a pillow behind his back, watching the way his face tightened with pain. His shirt had dried stiff with blood. She'd changed the bandage while he was unconscious, stitched the gash herself. He looked down at the clean wrapping and then at her. "You do that?" he asked. She nodded once. "Thank you," he said, quiet but clear. He ate slow, spoon shaking in his hand, and she sat near the fire, pretending not to watch. But she did, not just his movements, but his face. The way he kept to the shadows, even as the fire warmed the room. His eyes didn't wander much, just settled into the corners, scanning like a man used to trouble, like he was still expecting it to find him. He had a scar just beneath his left eye, thin and pale like an old story never told. His hair was dark, curling near the nape where sweat had dried. He looked like a man who had worked hard, maybe too hard, maybe for the wrong people. "You live here alone?" he asked after a while, not looking at her. "Does it matter?" He gave a small, strained smile. "Guess not." The silence came back, thick and full of things unsaid. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But there was something in the way he looked at her. Not soft, not cruel, just tired. Like he'd been carrying something for too long and didn't know how to set it down. When he finished the broth, she took the bowl without a word. He closed his eyes again, head leaning back against the pillow. She stared at him for a moment longer, then whispered more to herself than to him, "You're hiding something, Caleb." He didn't answer, but his fingers curled around the edge of the quilt like a man bracing for a storm he knew was coming. The snow didn't stop. Day after day, it fell thick and slow, swallowing the sky, the trees, and every sound beyond the cabin walls. The wind howled across the empty plains like a mourning song, rattling the windows and piling white drifts high against the door. Wren kept the stove going with a constant supply of chopped wood, her hands raw beneath her gloves, arms aching with each swing of the axe. Caleb watched from the window sometimes, his face unreadable behind the frostbitten glass, his breath fogging small ghost clouds against the pane. Inside, they moved around each other like strangers who shared too much space and not enough truth. Wren brought him broth, sometimes bread if she had the flour. Caleb ate slow, grateful, and always with a quiet "thank you" that sounded like it cost him something to say. He slept on the cot near the fire, his wound still healing but no longer seeping. When he could sit up for longer stretches, he began mending small things around the cabin. A broken hinge on the pantry door, a loose board by the hearth. He worked with careful hands, favoring his left side, and never said much. Wren didn't ask questions. Not yet. She swept the floors, chopped wood, hauled water from the half-frozen creek, all while keeping one ear open for any change in his tone or step. There was something in Caleb's silence that felt practiced, like he'd learned long ago how to keep things buried deep, and she didn't know if that meant he was dangerous or just broken like the rest of them. At night, the fire cracked low, and the air turned sharp with cold. She would sit in the rocking chair with a book on her lap, not really reading, just staring at the pages. Caleb would lie on his side, half asleep, eyes flickering toward the flames. Sometimes he asked about the book. Once he asked if she liked living alone. She said it was quiet. He nodded like he understood that better than most. One evening, the wind screamed harder than usual, snapping a tree somewhere in the woods beyond the barn. Wren stood at the door, hand on the latch, listening. Caleb rose from the cot, slower now but steadier, and stepped beside her. He didn't speak, just looked out at the white blur pressing against the windows like a wave. "I've seen storms," he said finally, "but this one's got teeth." She looked at him sideways. "You from the north?" He hesitated, then gave the smallest shake of his head. "Here and there." She waited for more, but it didn't come, just like every time before. Still, something was shifting, not in what he said, but in how he moved, how he met her eyes now without flinching. How he didn't reach for his coat or boots anymore, like part of him had stopped planning to leave the second he was strong enough. They were snowbound, two people who didn't belong to each other or the world outside. But in the quiet, in the chores, and the long silences, and the way they learned to pass the time without breaking it, a strange kind of trust began to grow, fragile, unspoken, like a bridge built out of weathered wood and old wounds. And still, Wren didn't ask how he came to bleed in her snow, but the question stayed behind her teeth, waiting for the day the silence broke. The snow had eased that morning, just enough to let light filter through the clouds like thin lace, silver on the drifts. Wren opened the cabin door to let in a breath of fresh air, steam rising from her coffee as she leaned against the frame, eyes scanning the endless white. Caleb was asleep, or pretending to be, his breath even under the quilt, one arm flung over his chest like he still guarded that wound even in dreams. She didn't trust him. Not really, but the rhythm of the days had numbed the edges of her wariness. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't lied. But he hadn't told her anything either, not about where he came from or what put the bullet in his side. And she'd stopped asking. Until now. She found the saddlebag beneath the cot while tidying, the leather stiff with cold dust clinging to the seams. Her hand paused over it, then moved without thinking. Not to pry, she told herself, just to see if anything inside needed mending. A shirt, some dried jerky wrapped in cloth, a small hunting knife dulled with use, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a worn piece of red bandana, was a silver locket. She knew it was nothing she should be touching. Her fingers hesitated, but then they moved anyway, unfolding the cloth. The locket was plain, round, tarnished at the edges, the clasp slightly bent. She opened it with care. Inside was a faded photo, edges yellowed from time. A man in a dark coat, standing stiff, his eyes sharp beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her breath caught. The coffee cup slipped from her hand and cracked against the floor, cold liquid spreading across the wood. She sank to her knees, heart thudding so loud she barely heard the wind rattle the windows. It was him, her father, Wren Calloway, years younger, but unmistakable. The crooked nose, the hard mouth, the eyes that never softened, not even for his own daughter. She'd only seen a few pictures of him from before the war, before the liquor, before the bitterness, but this was one of them, or a copy. She didn't know where it had come from, or why Caleb had it, but she knew what it meant. Her father had been shot behind the saloon 2 winters ago. One bullet to the chest, no witnesses, no answers. Sheriff poked around, said it might have been a drifter, maybe a debt unpaid. Then he stopped asking questions. People moved on. Wren never had. She sat on the floor for a long time, the locket heavy in her hand, her thoughts running like wild horses across frozen ground. It didn't make sense. Caleb had come from the snow, near dead. He hadn't hurt her, hadn't made a single move that hinted at violence, but why would he carry a picture of Wren Calloway? Why would he keep it hidden? That night, she barely looked at him. When he thanked her for the stew, she only nodded. Her hands shook as she washed the tin bowl, her eyes flicking to the cot where he slept again, face turned to the fire, half in shadow, and the questions whispered in her chest like wind through broken glass. Was this man the one who killed her father? And if he was, why did the sorrow in his eyes feel so real? The snow had packed down to a hard crust by the end of the week, and though the air still stung like needles, the sky had cleared enough to ride. Wren saddled her mare just after sunrise, bundled tight in her thickest coat, telling herself she needed flour, kerosene, salt, but the list wasn't what sent her down the trail toward town. It was the locket, still hidden in the pocket of her coat, the weight of it pressing against her ribs like a truth she wasn't ready to carry. Caleb didn't ask where she was going. He just stood by the fence mending a split rail with slow, careful movements, his side still stiff, his breath short if he bent too long. He nodded once as she rode past, eyes shaded beneath his hat, and she forced herself to nod back, calm and cold. But her hands gripped the reins too tightly, and the rhythm of the horse beneath her wasn't enough to steady the wild pacing of her thoughts. Town was quiet when she arrived. The snow piled high against the storefronts, smoke curling from chimneys in lazy spirals. She tied her mare outside the supply store, bought the things on her list, and then, with her heart thudding like a hammer, crossed the street to the old sheriff's office. The door creaked when she opened it. The familiar smell of pipe smoke and coffee thick in the air. Sheriff Dalton sat behind the desk, wrapped in a brown coat with a patch on one elbow, his boots propped on a stool, a newspaper in his lap. He looked up slow, squinted through his spectacles, and gave a nod. "Well, look what the wind blew in. You getting cabin fever up there?" Wren forced a smile. "Just restocking. Snow's not letting up easy this winter." Dalton grunted, folded his paper. "Ain't that the truth?" She stepped closer, heart pounding, her gloved hand pulling a folded scrap of paper from her pocket. She had spent the night before sketching it by lamplight. Rough lines, but enough to catch Caleb's jaw, the curve of his brow, the scar under his eye. She laid it on his desk without a word. Dalton leaned forward, peered at it. "That yours?" "No," she said. "Just someone passing through. Thought he looked familiar." The sheriff scratched his chin, brow furrowed. "I seen a face like this before. Maybe. Might have been a couple years back." He tapped the page. "Fella came through right before your pa got shot. Didn't stay long. Just long enough to stir trouble." Wren's stomach turned. "What kind of trouble?" Dalton shrugged. "He and your pa had words outside the saloon. Heated ones. Over what? I couldn't say. Next day, your pa was gone." He looked up at her. "You thinkin' this man had something to do with it?" She opened her mouth, but no words came, just a dry ache in her throat. "Don't know," she said finally. "Maybe." Dalton handed the sketch back. "Could be nothin'. Could be somethin'. Best be careful." She nodded, tucked the paper away, thanked him, and walked out into the cold. The ride home was slower. Her fingers were numb despite the gloves, and the wind seemed sharper than before. Every hoofbeat felt like a drum against her chest. She didn't want it to be Caleb. Didn't want the quiet man who mended her door and flinched when he laughed to be the same one who left her father bleeding in the mud. But the pieces were starting to fit, and no matter how she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was riding just behind her, silent and steady, waiting to be faced. The wind had picked up again by nightfall, sharp and restless, clawing at the eaves and slipping through the cracks in the walls like fingers searching for warmth. Wren stood on the porch, boots crunching over the hard-packed snow, arms wrapped around herself as she stared toward the woods. The last light of day had bled away hours ago, leaving the land in shades of black and blue. Caleb stepped out behind her without a word, the lantern swinging from his hand casting a soft glow across the yard. "There's a log stuck near the edge of the pile," she said without looking at him. "Frozen, clean to the ground." He nodded once, moved past her with that slow, careful gait that never let on how much pain he still carried. Together they worked, boots sliding, breath fogging, fingers stinging from cold. Caleb crouched low, grunted, and yanked at the end of the log until it gave way with a crack. Snow sprayed, landing in Wren's face, and she cursed under her breath, wiping at her cheeks with her sleeve. Caleb laughed, a short, rough sound, caught between surprise and amusement. It startled her, not the sound itself, but the way it reached into the hollow part of her chest where she'd been holding all her questions and doubt. For a moment, he looked young. Not soft, not innocent, but real, human. She wanted to hate him for it. They carried the log between them, shoulders closed, boots thudding on the steps as they entered the cabin. The fire had burned low again, just a soft orange flicker against the stone. Wren knelt to feed the flame, while Caleb leaned the log beside the hearth, his face caught in the warm light, shadows painting the hollows of his cheeks. Feels like this storm's got a mind of its own, he said quietly, rubbing his hands near the heat. Most things do out here, she replied, not turning. He nodded, then sat slowly on the stool near the door, wincing as he shifted his side. She watched him from the corner of her eye. The way he moved, the way he warmed his hands, the way he looked around the cabin like it was a place he hadn't expected to find himself. Nothing about him shouted guilt, but guilt didn't always wear a face. He caught her watching and offered a faint smile. You've been awful quiet tonight. I've had a lot on my mind. He didn't press, just nodded and looked into the fire. She wanted to shout at him, ask him straight, why did you have my father's picture? Did you shoot him? Did you run like a coward after? But the words sat heavy behind her teeth, stuck between memory and fear. He hadn't hurt her, hadn't once spoken harshly or moved too fast. If anything, he acted like a man trying not to break anything else. That night, long after he'd gone to sleep on the cot and the fire had shrunk to embers, Wren lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her fingers curled around the locket hidden beneath her pillow, the metal cold even through the cloth. Her father's face stared up at her, in her mind, hard and sharp, full of the kind of pride that always burned others before it burned out. And Caleb's face, half in firelight, half in shadow, stayed beside it, quiet, still, unreadable. She didn't sleep, just watched the dark settle and wondered which of those faces held the truth. The morning sun slipped weakly through the frost-covered windows, casting pale light across the cabin floor. Wren sat at the rough wooden table, her fingers tracing the worn grain as if searching for answers in the lines and knots. Caleb sat opposite her, shirt still stained but bandaged clean, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the hearth. The quiet between them stretched thin, heavy with unspoken things. She swallowed the lump in her throat, tried to steady her voice. Caleb, she said careful, do you know a man named Wren Calloway? The name hung in the air, sharper than the cold outside. Caleb's body stiffened, his eyes snapping up to meet hers, dark and guarded. For a moment, she thought he might look away, but he held her gaze like a man caught in a snare. That name means something to you? He asked, voice low, cautious. She forced a shake of her head. No, never heard it before. The lie slipped out too easily, too fast, and immediately she regretted it. Her fingers clenched tight beneath the table, nails digging into her palms. Caleb's face shifted, conflicted, maybe even pained, but he said nothing more. The fire flickered, shadows dancing across his jaw, as if hiding the truth in their depths. I've heard stories, he said finally, voice rough like gravel. Names like that come with weight. Wren nodded, swallowing hard. My father, Wren Calloway. He was killed 2 winters ago, shot in town. Nobody ever found who did it. Caleb's eyes darkened, the flicker of something lost or broken passing through them. I'm sorry. She looked away, out the window at the bare trees trembling in the cold wind. I don't know why I asked, she said quietly. Maybe I thought if you did know him, you'd tell me. He sighed, long and low, the sound filling the room like a storm waiting to break. Sometimes, people don't want to tell the stories that hurt the most. Wren's heart thudded painfully. The space between them felt smaller, charged with something fierce and fragile. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the gulf of silence, but fear held her still. Fear of the truth. Fear of what she might hear if he spoke it. I should have told you, she said, voice barely a whisper, about my father, about the locket. Caleb's gaze softened, but his jaw tightened. It's a heavy thing, carrying someone else's past. She nodded again, unable to meet his eyes. I lied. I didn't want you to know. But you do, he said, voice gentle, whether you admit it or not. The room grew colder, though the fire still burned low. They sat there, 2 people caught between the past and the present, the weight of secrets pressing down like the snow outside. Wren's chest ached with questions she couldn't voice, and Caleb's silence was an answer she wasn't ready to hear. For now, the truth waited in the shadows, wrapped in the quiet between them, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be denied. The night wrapped around the cabin like a heavy shroud, the wind outside moaning low and mournful through the trees. Wren lay awake in her bed, the quilt pulled tight beneath her chin, eyes fixed on the rough-hewn ceiling above. The shadows shifted and danced with the flicker of the dying fire, but her thoughts were far from the warmth of the room. Her father's face lingered in her mind, the hard set of his jaw, the cold glint in his eyes before the shot had torn through the stillness of that winter night. She pressed her fingers to her chest, where the ache still throbbed, fresh as the day she found him gone. Then a sound cut through the darkness, sudden and sharp. A cry, low and raw, torn from a throat, gripped by fear and regret. Wren bolted upright, heart pounding like a drum in the silence. The voice came again, closer this time, desperate and breaking. "I didn't mean to kill him." She slipped from the bed, her bare feet cold against the floor, and moved silently toward the door. Her hand closed tight around the rifle she kept leaned nearby, knuckles white against the worn wood. She pushed the door open just enough to peer into the dim room beyond. Caleb lay on the cot, tangled in blankets, face pale and twisted in torment. Sweat gleamed on his brow, dark against the pale skin, and his breath came in ragged gasps. His hands clenched the quilt, trembling, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. Wren stood frozen, torn between anger and pity. The man who had appeared so quiet, so guarded, was now broken and raw before her eyes. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the cold air, mixing with the ghosts of her own pain. She wanted to turn away, to pretend she hadn't heard, but something held her rooted. The words echoed in her mind, stirring the bitter truth she had long tried to bury. The truth that the man she had saved from the snow might be the same one who took everything from her. Morning came slow, pale and gray, the sun a weak glow behind the clouds. Caleb lay still, eyes closed, breathing steady now, but his face drawn and tired. Wren sat by the window, watching the snow drift down in soft flakes, the silence thick between them. Neither spoke of the night's shadows or the broken whispers that had shattered the quiet. The past did not stay buried, no matter how deep it was pushed. It seeped through cracks, staining the present with doubt and fear. Wren's hand brushed the locket beneath her pillow, cold and heavy, a reminder of the ties that bound them both to memories better left forgotten. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The man beside her carried a weight as heavy as her own grief, and the truth they shared threatened to tear them apart. But for now, they were simply two souls caught in the storm, waiting for the dawn to break and for the reckoning that must come with the light. The morning light was soft and gray when Wren found Caleb sitting by the hearth, staring into the fire as if it held all the answers. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of flames and the slow drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. She took a deep breath, the weight of the night still heavy in her chest, and stepped closer. Her eyes met his, hollow and haunted, and she knew the time for silence was over. "Tell me," she said, voice steady but low. "Everything. The truth." Caleb looked away at first, fingers tracing the grain of the wooden floor, but the burden inside him was too great to hold back. His shoulders sagged, a weary man finally letting the years of guilt settle onto his skin like a second skin. He swallowed hard, then began. "It wasn't supposed to end that way," he said, voice cracked and rough. "Your father and I, we argued, over land, about where the line should be, who had right. He pulled first. I thought I was going to be killed." Wren listened, heart hammering with every word, the room shrinking around her. "I fired to warn him, only to scare him off. Didn't mean to kill Henry Calloway. That wasn't my plan." He paused, his eyes dark and distant. But the bullet found his chest, and he fell like a stone. "I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay." His hands shook as he pulled from his pocket a small piece of worn cloth, faded and torn, the only remnant he'd kept hidden all this time. Wren reached out, fingers trembling, and took it from him. It smelled faintly of earth and smoke. "I buried him," Caleb said, voice breaking, "deep in the woods, where no one would find him. My hands were shaking. I covered the grave with leaves and snow. Then I ran." Tears welled in his eyes, unbidden and raw. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he try to explain away what he had done. He only remembered. Wren felt as if the floor had vanished beneath her. The man she had saved, nursed back to life, was also the one who had shattered hers. Her breath caught, tears stinging behind her lashes. For a moment, all the anger and pain she had buried rose up like a flood, threatening to drown her. But instead of hatred, she felt something colder, a hollow ache that settled deep in her bones. The truth was heavier than any lie, more brutal than any silence. She looked into Caleb's weary face and saw not a monster, but a man broken by the same storm that had taken her father from her. A man haunted by a mistake he could never undo. The room was still again, filled only with the sound of the fire and two hearts learning to carry the same sorrow. The past could not be changed, but in that moment, Wren understood that neither of them was free until they faced it together. Wren sat at the rough wooden table, the weight of the revolver heavy in her hands. It was her father's gun, old and worn, the steel dulled by years of use but still deadly as the day it was made. She pulled the cylinder open carefully, laying each round into place, the clicks loud in the quiet cabin. When the last bullet slid home, she closed the chamber and set the gun down between her and Caleb, the cold metal resting like a challenge on the scratched surface. Her fingers trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the storm raging inside her. She looked at him, his face pale in the firelight, eyes steady and tired. The man who had carried so much guilt, so many secrets, sat across from her now, and for the first time, the distance between them felt small enough to cross, or too wide to ever close. "I should hate you," she said softly, her voice breaking like the wind outside. "I should be pointing this at your chest, pulling the trigger, and never looking back." Caleb's gaze didn't falter. He reached out a hand, resting it near the gun but not touching it. "You wouldn't be wrong to," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. Not from you." The silence that followed was thick, filled with all the words neither of them dared say. Wren's breath came fast, her chest tight, as if she were holding back a flood she couldn't stop. She wanted to hate him, needed to hate him, but something in his eyes stopped her. There was no anger there, no cruelty, just a tired kind of sorrow that felt like a wound as deep as her own. Her fingers curled into fists on the table, nails pressing into the wood, pain sharp and real. The gun gleamed coldly between them, a symbol of everything broken and unfinished. She thought of her father, how he had walked these very floors, how his laughter once filled the air before the bullet stole it away. She thought of the man sitting before her, the man who had carried the weight of that bullet longer than she could imagine. Her heart tore in two, caught between the fierce ache of loss and the fragile thread of something like mercy. She swallowed hard, eyes burning, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Caleb shifted, the firelight catching the scar beneath his eye, the line of pain still etched on his face. "Whatever you decide," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I'll live with it." Wren looked at the revolver again, the cold metal so simple and terrible. She could end it all here, end the questions and the waiting, and walk away with a heart empty but free. Or she could lay down the gun and face the darkness, with a courage she didn't know she had. Her breath hitched, tears threatening to spill. She didn't reach for the gun, didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she looked back into Caleb's eyes and saw not a stranger, but a man broken and trying to be whole again. The room held its breath, the fire crackling softly, and Wren let out a slow, trembling breath. Her soul felt raw and torn, but in that moment, she chose something harder than hate. She chose to see him, to see the truth beneath the scars. And for the first time since the snow took her father, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared hope for, maybe even forgiveness. The air outside had softened with the coming of spring, the harsh bite of winter melting into a slow, steady thaw. The snowbanks shrank, the creek sang louder as it found its way beneath melting ice, and the trees began to shake off their heavy blankets of frost. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warmer, the light brighter, casting long shadows that seemed less heavy, less filled with the weight of cold and loss. Caleb stood near the door, boots scuffed and coat patched but his face leaner, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. His eyes, once shadowed with doubt, held a flicker of something new, uncertainty, maybe hope, or the flickering flame of a man trying to find his place again. He looked toward the horizon, where the sky stretched wide and pale blue, the promise of open roads and the freedom they held. "I can't stay," he said finally, voice low but steady. "This wasn't meant to be. I'm a stranger here." Wren watched him, hands folded in her lap, heart tightening with a strange ache. She said nothing at first, just studied the way his shoulders held the weight of years he'd carried alone, the way his fingers twitched, as if wanting to reach for something he couldn't name. Then she stood and crossed the room, moving quietly until she stood before him. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the silver locket. The metal caught the firelight, gleaming softly as she opened it and held it out to him. "If you walk away," she said, voice steady but soft, "take all of it." Caleb's eyes widened, the weight of the gesture sinking in like a stone dropped deep into still water. He reached out, fingers trembling, and closed the locket gently, as if it were a fragile thing, something too precious to hold tightly. He looked at her then, really looked, like a man drowning and desperate for breath, for shore. His breath hitched, eyes shining with something raw and real. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them stretched wide, filled with the unspoken regret, forgiveness, fear, and a flicker of something like trust. Then, slowly, Caleb shook his head. "I won't run," he said. "Not this time." Wren felt a relief she hadn't known she needed wash over her, sharp and unexpected. The man who had come through the storm, broken and haunted, was choosing to stay, choosing to face the past and the future, whatever they might hold. They stood there, two souls on the edge of something uncertain but real, the thaw outside creeping into their bones and hearts. The locket rested in Caleb's palm, a symbol of all they had lost and all they might still find. And as the first buds of spring pushed through the melting earth, Wren knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, filled with shadows and light. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Because the man who had once been a stranger was now someone who stayed, someone who might, in time, become something more. The snow melted slowly, like a quiet promise whispered across the land. The frozen earth softened beneath the first warm rains, and wildflowers pushed through the dirt, shy and stubborn, coloring the hills with pale yellows and soft purples. The creek sang again, a gentle rush of water that carried the memory of winter away, even if the chill still lingered in the shadows. Wren stepped out onto the ridge above the cabin, the wind tugging at her hair and the sunlight warming her face for the first time in what felt like forever. Caleb stood beside her, steady and quiet, the man who had come into her life like a storm and stayed like the slow, steady thaw. They didn't speak much. Words still felt fragile between them, like glass waiting to be shaped or shattered. She looked out at the valley below, where the fields stretched wide and wild, and the scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air. The past was still there, like the shadows in the corners of her mind. She didn't forgive what had happened. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she had come to see Caleb not as the man who took her father away, but as the man who had carried that weight with a broken heart and haunted eyes. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch gentle and sure. She didn't pull away. For the first time, she felt something softer between them, a quiet understanding that was bigger than pain or anger, something that could grow like the wildflowers in the thawing earth. They walked side by side down the ridge, boots crunching over dry leaves and new grass. The silence between them was no longer heavy but comfortable, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Wren's heart still bore the scar her father's death had left, a deep and jagged mark that no time could fully heal. But as she looked at Caleb's steady stride, the man who had stayed through storms and secrets, she felt a flicker of hope. The scar didn't have to be a curse. It could be a reminder of survival, of the strength it took to face the darkest winters and still find the courage to keep walking. The road ahead was uncertain, and the wounds still whispered their stories in the quiet moments. But together, they could carry the past without letting it break them. Wren breathed in the fresh air, the cold and the warmth mingling in her lungs. She glanced at Caleb, who met her eyes with a softness that reached past the hurt and into something real. No grand promises, no easy fixes, just two people learning to live with their history and each other. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them as they made their way back to the cabin. The wildflowers bloomed at their feet, stubborn and bright, a sign that even after the coldest winters, life could still find a way to grow. And in that quiet moment, Wren knew she was ready to try. If this story stirred something in you, give it a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories where love, loss, and redemption collide, make sure to subscribe to our channel.